Good day, chaps. So today's video is the first of our request vehicles from one of our followers. And because it's weird, eccentric and British, of course, we have quite a lot of good photos of it. So the vehicle is the Alecto, which was very much an unwanted little vehicle, and despite some rather good features, only a very limited number were ever built. The requirement for what would become the Alecto goes back to 1942. With a need for a 95mm close support howitzer on a light air-portable chassis that could support infantry in the field and be fully mobile. The British had a few options available at the time, and for this we need to go back to the A-17 and A-18 light tanks. We'll start with the A-18. This was drawn up by Vickers with a design based on request from the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff for a series of 2 tanks. One was to have 70mm of frontal armour, the other a lighter tank to be immune to German 20mm cannon fire. Vickers decided the suspension for the latter should be based on that of their prototype A-17. Vickers was not confident with the requested range required of 200 km on A-18, with the size of the internal fuel tanks. However, with a smaller engine of 180 horsepower, they could avoid external drop tanks. A speed of 22 miles per hour had been achieved on a test track at Farnborough, with this smaller engine fitted to the A-17, and once they applied it to the A-18 concept, they felt that it would be marginally slower than its German contemporaries, but offered nearly twice the armour over the frontal arc. The primary armament for the A-18 was to be a 2-pounder gun with a Beezer machine gun coaxial, and 1 Beezer each in 2 small sub-turrets. A few novel features were included for the time, including electrical powered ventilation for the crew, a hull turret compass system to help the gunners keep on track, as well as internal signalling lights. Work got as far as the sub-turrets in the upper hull being built and tested at Chertsey in 1941, before the order was cancelled. All remaining parts were then moved over to the A-17 development or scrapped. The A-17, also named Tetrarch, started as a light tank with a 15mm Beezer machine gun in the turret, which was then later changed to a 2-pounder gun, and later again when a request for 3-inch howitzer for close support work was added into the plan. Although it filled most of its roles, the Tetrarch was deemed to be lacking in armour. Meanwhile, in 1941, plans for a small light cruiser tank were drawn up at the Vickers Chertsey Works in June 1941, with the name A-25 Light Cruiser Tank, which would later be named Harry Hopkins, after President Roosevelt's chief diplomatic advisor. However, problems with the vehicle's layout and mission creep affected production, and although over 200 were ordered, by the war's end less than 100 were built in various stages. When the further requirement for a 95mm close support howitzer was issued during the war that would be deployable with airborne troops and have a very low profile and a good turn of speed, they turned to this hull and started to make up their plans. Work began on this vehicle, initially called M192, on the 20th of November 1942, under the name 95mm SP mounting. It's worth noting that this vehicle was not called SP3, as this designation refers to the M10C Achilles, with SP1 being Archer, SP2 being Avenger, and the SP4 being the Centurion casemated tank later on. The primary weapon was the 95mm howitzer, which is actually 94mm, and renamed as there are several weapons of the same calibre, although the system would still get confusing as we will later see. This weapon was to be mounted on a centre pivot of the hull, with 26 degrees of elevation for indirect fire out to 6,000 yards, and 5 degrees of gun depression, with 15 degrees left and 15 degrees right. 48 rounds were to be carried, consisting of high explosive, shape charge, and smoke rounds. The vehicle was to be 5.4 foot tall with a driver's shield up, 14 foot long, and have a speed of 30 miles per hour, using a Meadows 12-cylinder Hop 2 158 horsepower engine at 4,400 RPM, coupled to a Meadows 42 5-speed gearbox with a Borg and Beck clutch. The suspension carried over in a modified form from the Tetrarch, with 4 distinct bulbous road wheels per side, with servo-assisted steering and controlled via a wheel, not tillers. The vehicle was also able to use skid steering for sharper turns. The work began in 1942, however, much like the Hopkins, progress was slow. The vehicle crept up in reports at every tank board meeting, However, as the war progressed into the last few years, the requirement and need for such a vehicle began to drop, and it was recommended that the initial order be dropped to 800 vehicles on the 27th of May 1944. Although the director of the Royal Armoured Corps felt that the 95mm fire support version of Harry Hopkins should be given priority over that of the regular Harry Hopkins in every case. In 1944, the vehicle was given the name Alecto 1, and like other tanks or vehicles that were to be air-portable, it took a name based from classical Greek antiquity, Alecto being one of the three Furies or Erinyes, which are chthonic deities responsible for punishing those who would use anger to murder, and could be cooled down by an avenging relative. The name would be later changed to AFV Tracked Close Support Alecto 1. The crew was initially to be 5 men, located in some rather interesting positions. The driver was located amidships in an almost pod-like position behind the gun, in a semi-raised cockpit, with the gunner, commander and 2 loaders situated on foldable seats in the front section, 2 either side of the gun. The ammunition was stored in the sides of the vehicle, with 24 rounds per side that extended out over the running gear. The ammunition was placed in such a way that the loader could load the gun while remaining seated in a sitting position, although this was far from ideal. It's often written that Alecto came in 4 different marks with 4 different guns, and this is bollocks. The vehicle remained Alecto 1, and only 2 calibers were used, but the confusion is easy to explain. The first weapon fitted was a 95mm howitzer, but this was made up of 3 parts. The barrel was a section from a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun barrel. The breech mechanism was that of the Ordnance quick-firing 25-pounder howitzer, and the recoil mechanism was of the Ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder anti-tank gun, with a shot weighing 25 pounds, and so sometimes this gun is written as 25-pounder. For example, in documents we get a Churchill 25-pounder tank, but this is not to be confused with the 88mm field gun that fired a 25-pounder shot. The weapon on Alecto, called the 25-pounder, also has a distinct grill-shaped muzzle brake. The second 95mm gun was the Ordnance quick-firing 95mm infantry howitzer with a modified recuperator. This also fired a shot weighing 25 pounds, but did not have the distinctive muzzle brake and counterweight at the end. This howitzer, initially intended for infantry use, was not well received at the bottom end due to several faults, although 1,000 were ordered and thus moved over to the Alecto program. There was never a 32-pounder version, often touted as a Mark IV Alecto, as while this was also a 94mm round, it was also some 90 centimeters long, with the round being a 94 by 909mm in size, nearly the length of the gun mounted on the Alecto. There was, however, a 6-pounder version. The need for this was raised in June 1944 at the 39th Tank Board meeting at the Adelphi Hotel for a 6-pounder self-propelled anti-tank version. Work began on it in November 1944 at Elswick, and the 5th pilot hull of the original series of Alectos was converted over and sent for testing at Chertsey. Meanwhile, the first 95mm versions were ready in March 1945 at Elswick and sent for testing, and by December 1945, 65 vehicles were recorded as having been delivered. During testing, several modifications were made. Shock absorbers were added to the front and rear stations. The driver's screen was changed to a plastic window to prevent mud spraying into his face. One of the crew positions was dropped in favour of a 4-man crew, and a number 19 wireless set added with 2 raised stowage areas above the ammunition bins. This radio was deemed essential as it was decided to place the Alectos into reconnaissance units. As the war was over in Germany, work focused for use of roles in the Far East, and the Alectos underwent amphibious modifications. This involved large screens being added to the machine with suitable waterproofing. However, unlike the other canvas screens, these were transparent to allow the crew to see. Tests were done both at Chertsey and in open seas, and the vehicle proved quite good at paddling about. The vehicle also had a large canvas screen designed to go over the crew compartment to keep out the rain and so forth. At least 3 other variants were tested. One had its tracks and suspension removed and wheels were fitted. This vehicle appears to be a dynamometer, based on the rear drop-down wheel fitted at the back. A second machine was given a new suspension system with twin bogies between the first and rear wheels, while at least one vehicle was converted over to a command role to work with the other Alectos, with the gun removed, an enclosed structure built and additional radios fitted. By late 1945 and early 1946, it was decided by the tank board that the Alectos were not really needed at all, and production dwindled to a stop with just 90 recorders having been made in total. We know that some were sent to Palestine and a few demonstrated in Egypt, while others were used up in training purposes, with several regiments receiving 4 of each. These were the 1st Royal Dragoons, the 11th Hussars, Prince Albert's Own, 43rd Wessex Division and the 15th Scottish Division. Despite not being picked up by the UK in any significant numbers, the Alecto was tested by the Norwegians and the Swiss, who wished to use the vehicle as a medium-gun artillery tractor. The vehicle was found to have problems with snow and ice building up on the tracks, and modifications were made, but the Swiss also requested a front-mounted engine on their version. Further tests were carried out, but no orders were placed. A few more were converted into engineering vehicles with hydraulic dozer blades added, and parts of the Alecto were used in the development of the CT-26 APC. The final use of an Alecto appears to be used during the flooding in the UK in Shepperton during the 1947 Great Floods, when one vehicle held privately at Chertsey waded into the town to rescue stranded workers from there and carry them to safety. Today, no Alectos remain anywhere that we know of. Well guys, if you like that video, do give us a like and subscribe and hit that notification button, and if you want something discussed, do let us know below what it will be. And until next time, toodle pip.